When people look at the Second World War and examine the sheer scale of Nazi Germany's military operations, one question comes up again and again. How did a country that was struggling with economic collapse only a decade earlier suddenly become capable of producing thousands of tanks, millions of rifles, countless artillery shells, submarines, aircraft, and all the fuel, steel, rubber, ammunition, and manpower needed to wage war across an entire continent? It is easy to imagine that Germany must have built this machine through domestic industry alone. But the truth is far more disturbing. The Nazi war machine was sustained through a combination of deception, financial manipulation, and one of the largest programs of theft and exploitation that Europe had ever seen. To understand this system, one must look not only at German factories, but also at the conquered territories whose resources, wealth, industries, and people were stripped away piece by piece to keep the German war effort alive. The story begins in the years leading up to the war, when Germany was still recovering from hyperinflation and the Great Depression. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi leadership promised the German people jobs, stability, and national revival. And part of that promise meant rapidly expanding the military, even when there was no legal or financial foundation for such expansion. The German government secretly borrowed enormous sums of money, issued concealed loans, and created shadow budgets that were hidden from the public. They masked the true cost of rearmament by using off-the-books institutions like the MIFO bills system, which allowed the government to pay arms manufacturers with promissory notes disguised as private credit rather than direct government spending. This meant that German citizens never saw the full price of the arms buildup, because much of it was intentionally hidden. However, even with creative accounting, deception, and hidden loans, Germany could not sustain a long war on its own. The leadership knew this. Germany lacked oil, rubber, and other critical materials, and the Nazi leadership believed that the only way to secure a long-term war economy was to seize the resources of other countries. War, in the Nazi worldview, was not only about conquest. It was about acquiring the factories, raw materials, and wealth of the territories they intended to dominate. As soon as the invasion of Poland occurred in 1939, this strategy became clear. German authorities immediately took control of Polish factories, mines, transportation networks, and farmland. They imposed strict taxes and economic penalties that forced Poland to pay for the presence of German soldiers. They seized banks, gold reserves, and even personal savings accounts, redirecting all funds to Germany. This pattern repeated in every country Germany occupied: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece, Czechoslovakia, and parts of the Soviet Union all experienced the same systematic economic plunder. German administrators arrived with detailed plans for how to extract maximum value from each region. Factories that once produced civilian goods were turned into centers for military manufacturing. Steel mills, textile plants, chemical factories, automobile plants, and rail workshops were all reorganized under German supervision. Every machine, every tool, and every skilled worker became part of a forced industrial network whose purpose was not to enrich the local population, but to strengthen the German war effort. France became particularly important to the German economy because it had well-developed industries and a large supply of raw materials. The Germans took over French automobile factories that had produced commercial vehicles and forced them to build German-designed trucks and military equipment. Shipyards that had once supported French commercial fleets were put to work repairing German U-boats and naval vessels. French locomotives, railway lines, and rolling stock were controlled entirely by German administrators, allowing them to transport troops and supplies efficiently across long distances. Yet industrial seizure was only one part of the strategy. The Nazis also relied heavily on mass forced labor, one of the harshest and most horrifying aspects of their economic system. Millions of people from across Europe were captured, transported, and forced to work in German factories, on German farms, and in German military production lines. These workers included civilians from occupied countries, prisoners of war, and eventually prisoners from concentration camps. They were placed in terrible conditions, often starving, abused, and denied basic necessities. Their labor cost Germany almost nothing, which made wartime production dramatically cheaper. German factories were filled with forced laborers who built weapons they would never benefit from, supporting a war machine that oppressed their own countries. Inside Germany itself, forced laborers became a critical part of everyday economic activity. In some German cities, more than a third of the industrial workforce eventually consisted of foreigners who had been forced into service. German families used forced laborers on their farms. German companies used forced laborers to keep production running. Every major industrial corporation, from steelworks to chemical companies, benefited from this system. Without exploited labor, Germany could not have maintained its production levels as the war dragged on. While factories were seized and workers were enslaved, the Nazis also engaged in direct financial theft. As soon as a country fell under German occupation, a system called occupation costs was imposed. This meant that the local government was required to pay enormous daily fees for the privilege of having German troops stationed within their borders. These fees were deliberately set at levels so high that the occupied nation would slowly collapse financially, allowing Germany to siphon away wealth without using its own budget. For example, Norway and Greece were forced to pay enormous sums every day, money that was funneled directly into the German treasury or used to pay German soldiers. In some countries, the cost of occupation consumed most of the national budget, leaving the population impoverished while Germany continued to build tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and fortifications using stolen funds. In addition to this, the Nazis seized gold reserves from national banks, emptied private vaults, confiscated foreign currency, and looted priceless artworks and cultural treasures. They took jewelry, silver, and valuables from civilians. They froze bank accounts, seized farmland, stole livestock, and demanded forced deliveries of food, coal, oil, and raw materials. In territories across Eastern Europe, grain, meat, fuel, and industrial goods were stripped away systematically, shipped by train to Germany, and used to sustain the war effort. German soldiers often ate food taken directly from occupied villages, while local populations starved. The Nazi government also practiced a type of economic recycling on a scale never seen before. Captured enemy equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, and guns, was repaired, repainted, and pressed into German service. German engineers modified captured Soviet tanks to fit German ammunition. They took thousands of French trucks and used them in their own supply convoys. They reused uniforms, boots, tools, and metal scraps. Nothing was wasted. They turned broken machinery into spare parts, melted down wreckage for steel, and stripped battlefields for anything of value. Resource shortages forced them to be efficient, and the brutality of occupation allowed them to gather whatever they needed from conquered lands. One of the most shocking aspects of Nazi economic exploitation was how scientific and organized it became. Economists, administrators, industrial planners, and military officers worked together to map out Europe's resources, calculating precisely how much coal, iron, oil, and grain each region could provide. They created detailed schedules for shipping materials to Germany, established quotas for forced labor, and built a continental system that fed German industry. It was not just random looting, it was a coordinated program designed to transform conquered Europe into a giant engine serving Germany's war aims. In Eastern Europe, especially in Poland and the Western Soviet Union, this system was taken to an even more brutal level. German policy there was based not only on resource extraction, but also on racial ideology. The Nazis believed that the local populations were inferior and intended to reduce them to starvation conditions while seizing their land and using survivors as forced workers. Food produced in these regions was shipped directly to German cities and German soldiers, leaving millions of civilians facing hunger and death. Germany's army marched on territories whose economies were deliberately broken to feed the invaders. As the war continued and German losses mounted, the burden placed on occupied countries grew heavier. The more Germany struggled, the more it leaned on forced labor and stolen resources. The Reich demanded higher occupation fees, seized more property, and tightened its grip on factories. When Allied forces bombed German cities and destroyed industrial sites, the Nazis compensated by increasing production in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They doubled the number of forced laborers. They stripped even more equipment from occupied territories. By 1944, the German war machine was running on stolen time, stolen labor, and stolen resources. Ultimately, the system began to collapse. Resistance movements sabotaged factories, destroyed rail lines, and killed collaborators. Allied bombers targeted industrial centers still under German control. Forced laborers resisted or slowed their work. German administrators found it increasingly difficult to maintain the massive network of extraction. When Germany's armies retreated, they often tried to destroy factories and infrastructure so that nothing useful would fall into Allied hands. But by then, it was too late. The war economy that had been built through robbery, coercion, and exploitation crumbled under its own weight, just as the military front collapsed. In the end, the Nazi war machine was not sustained by economic skill or industrial genius. It was sustained by theft on a scale the world had never seen, by the forced labor of millions who had no choice, by the seizure of factories and resources across the continent, and by financial manipulation that hid the true cost of war from the German public. The weapons, tanks, bullets, and aircraft that Germany used to wage war across Europe were paid for not by German taxpayers, but by the suffering of conquered people whose wealth, labor, and lives were taken to fuel a destructive empire.